February 19, 1945. The island of Iwo Jima stood like a black scar upon the Pacific, its jagged volcanic rock rising from an ocean that smelled of salt and blood. At dawn, the air shook with the thunder of naval bombardment. Battleships roared, their massive guns hurling shells that split the earth into fire and smoke. Waves of Marines pressed forward in landing craft, their rifles clutched tightly, eyes fixed on the shoreline that spewed bullets and artillery like a furnace of death. From beneath bunkers carved into the volcanic stone, Japanese defenders watched with cold precision. They had endured days of bombardment, yet they lived hidden, waiting. What they did not know was that among the waves of American steel crawling toward shore was a weapon so terrifying, so unthinkable, it would burn itself into the memory of every survivor: the flamethrower tank. The Marines surged onto the beaches, sinking into volcanic ash that swallowed their boots like quicksand. Machine guns raked their lines, cutting men down in staggering numbers. Smoke from exploding mortar shells drifted low across the black sands, turning daylight into a haunted twilight. Above it all loomed Mount Suribachi, a silent sentinel, its tunnels and caves filled with unseen guns. The Japanese strategy was clear: let the Marines land, then bleed them dry inch by inch. Yet even as their guns spat fire, something massive groaned across the beach. Sherman tanks grinding forward, their tracks biting into ash. But these were no ordinary Shermans. Welded to their frames were monstrous fuel tanks. Coiled hoses like serpents snaked toward flame projectors. The Japanese eyes narrowed in disbelief. Could these machines truly breathe fire? A sudden hiss, a metallic cough, then a stream of flame erupted, spearing through the smoke. It was not the timid arc of a man's portable flamethrower, but a torrent. 50 yards of liquid fire, roaring like a dragon unleashed. The flames washed across a bunker mouth, clinging, crawling, devouring oxygen. The air screamed as men trapped inside tried to escape, only to find the fire followed them. Japanese soldiers, hardened veterans who had faced artillery, machine guns, even tanks before, recoiled in shock. Fire was different. Fire suffocated. Fire denied shelter. Where steel could be endured, fire consumed the soul. On that first morning, the Marines had found themselves stalled. Their rifles could not clear the pillboxes. Grenades only scratched the surface of reinforced bunkers. But as the flamethrower tanks advanced, a shift occurred. Marines cheered as the dragons of steel exhaled sheets of fire, burning through defenses that had resisted everything else. Japanese officers, peering through periscopes in their hidden strongholds, could only stare. Their meticulously prepared defenses, tunnels, interlocking fields of fire, underground chambers, were being erased by a single blast of flame. What was meant to be an impregnable fortress suddenly became a tomb. The battlefield became a nightmare tableau, smoke mixed with fire, until the very air shimmered like molten glass. Ash swirled in choking clouds, clinging to sweat-soaked uniforms. The tanks pressed forward, each one a moving inferno, their projectors spitting fire with every pause. The Japanese tried to adjust, directing artillery toward the flamethrower tanks, but the volcanic terrain betrayed them. Shells bounced or dug harmlessly into the ash. The tanks, scarred and battered, kept advancing. Inside their steel bellies, crews worked feverishly, knowing every step closer to the bunkers meant survival for the Marines following behind. For the defenders, disbelief turned into horror. Fire gushed into caves where soldiers clutched rifles, waiting to ambush. In seconds, oxygen was gone, flames filling every crevice. Screams echoed, then were smothered. Some Japanese soldiers, faced with the unbearable choice between burning alive or charging into machine gun fire, chose the latter. They emerged from tunnels, rifles blazing, only to be cut down in the open. For the first time, even the most fanatical warriors realized their bunkers, once symbols of protection, had become traps. The very earth they trusted betrayed them. The Marines pressed forward behind this wall of fire. Each burst of flame was followed by shouts of "Move up, move up!" As infantry advanced, rifles at the ready, clearing what remained. The synergy between man and machine was undeniable. The flamethrower tanks ripped open defenses, and Marines sealed the ground gained with blood. On radios, commanders marveled at the effect. Reports spoke of bunkers silenced in seconds, resistance collapsing where before it had endured for hours. To the Marines who had seen their comrades torn apart on Tarawa and Saipan, the sight of Japanese strongholds burning felt like a grim form of justice. But for the Japanese defenders, the psychological blow was devastating. Their doctrine taught endurance, taught them to survive under bombardment, to outlast artillery, to let the Americans waste their strength on frontal assaults. Yet how does one endure flame? How does one outlast fire that hunts you into the deepest recesses of stone? Their reports later recovered spoke in disbelief. Some described the tanks as monsters of fire, others simply called them hell machines. The shock of seeing fire where none should exist, spewing from the maw of a tank, left many in despair. By nightfall, the beaches of Iwo Jima glowed with embers. The wreckage of landing craft smoldered alongside blackened bunkers, their entrances still hissing with smoke. Marines huddled in foxholes, the memory of burning strongholds etched into their minds. Japanese survivors, hidden deeper underground, whispered among themselves, shaken not by the shells that rained daily, but by the sudden unstoppable inferno that no sandbag, no steel door, no courage could repel. For the first time on Iwo Jima, the defenders faced an enemy that not only killed but annihilated, leaving nothing but ash. And so the battle began, not just for ground but for the very soul of the island. For the Marines, the flamethrower tanks were a promise, that the impossible could be broken, that no fortress was eternal. For the Japanese, they were a revelation too terrible to accept. The age-old soldier's bond with his bunker, his trench, his hidden shelter had been shattered. There was no safety now, not even beneath the earth itself. The island would burn, and with it the defenders' belief in survival. The black sands of Iwo Jima had become the stage for a new kind of warfare, where steel no longer fired bullets alone, but breathed fire like the dragons of legend. By the winter of 1945, the Pacific War had become a brutal race against time. The Japanese Empire, though battered, remained defiant, its soldiers prepared to die rather than surrender. Each island in the Central Pacific was transformed into a fortress, a labyrinth of tunnels, bunkers, and artillery positions designed to bleed the Americans dry. On the horizon loomed the great invasion of the Japanese home islands, but first, one crucial outpost had to be taken. Iwo Jima, barely 8 square miles of volcanic rock, yet invaluable to both sides. For the Americans, it promised airfields from which damaged bombers returning from Tokyo could land, and a staging point for the final assault. For the Japanese, it was a last bastion, a shield for the homeland. Every inch of ground would be contested. The broader war had already revealed the terrible logic of attrition. At Tarawa, Marines had learned how fanatical resistance could turn a tiny atoll into a charnel house. At Saipan, they had faced the horror of banzai charges and the tragedy of civilians leaping from cliffs rather than be captured. By the time American planners turned their eyes to Iwo Jima, they knew the cost would be astronomical. Intelligence estimated weeks of bombardment might not even scratch the island's defenses. Yet they had no choice. In Washington, calculations were cold and pragmatic. If seizing Iwo Jima saved thousands of bomber crews, then the sacrifice of Marines was deemed acceptable. The Japanese High Command understood this too. They prepared not to win, but to kill as many Americans as possible, to make the invasion of Japan itself seem unthinkable. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of the garrison, rejected the futile banzai charges of earlier campaigns. Instead, he ordered his men to dig deep into the volcanic stone, creating an underground fortress of unimaginable complexity. Nearly 12 miles of tunnels connected more than 1,500 rooms, bunkers, and firing positions. Guns were hidden in caves. Artillery rolled into the open only to fire before vanishing back into concealment. The black sands would swallow the Americans, and the mountain itself would spit fire. Against this web of defenses, the U.S. Marines brought overwhelming firepower. The invasion fleet numbered nearly 500 ships, from battleships and cruisers to landing craft and carriers. In 3 days of pre-invasion bombardment, they poured more explosives onto Iwo Jima than had been used on any Pacific island before. Yet Kuribayashi's defenses survived, shielded by the volcanic rock. When the bombardment ended and the Marines surged ashore, they found themselves under a storm of fire that seemed to erupt from nowhere. Machine guns scythed through the first waves. Mortars fell with terrifying precision. The black sands themselves, soft and clinging, slowed every step. The Japanese strategy was working. The Marines were trapped on the beaches, slaughtered in the open. But the Americans had learned bitter lessons from earlier battles. They knew artillery alone could not clear bunkers. They knew flamethrowers, though effective, were deadly for the men who carried them, making those soldiers the first targets for snipers. They needed something new, something that combined the armor of a tank with the terror of fire. The answer had been forged in workshops back in the United States, where engineers experimented with welding fuel tanks to Sherman hulls, running thick hoses to flame projectors mounted on turrets. The result was a machine that could spray liquid fire farther and longer than any man-portable weapon, a tank that carried the power of hell itself. By early 1945, these modified tanks, nicknamed Ronsons or Zippos by the Marines, were being shipped to the Pacific. They were clumsy in appearance, with fuel trailers attached like strange appendages, but their effect on the battlefield was undeniable. At Saipan and Tinian, they had already proven their worth, incinerating caves that resisted days of bombardment. Yet on Iwo Jima, their role would be magnified tenfold. Kuribayashi's fortress was not a loose collection of caves, it was an entire island turned into a bunker. Conventional weapons could not root out such defenses. Fire would have to do the work. The Marines who landed on February 19th knew the flamethrower tanks were with them, but few had seen them in action. Their first encounters with Japanese defenses left them desperate, pinned down, unable to advance against bunkers that seemed invulnerable. When the tanks finally moved forward, belching gouts of flame into the black mouths of pillboxes, the psychological effect was immediate. Marines cheered, shouting over the roar of engines while Japanese defenders reeled in disbelief. It was as if the very laws of war had shifted. For centuries, soldiers had trusted in walls, in earthworks, in the strength of stone and steel. But no wall could stop fire that crawled through cracks, sucked the oxygen from rooms and turned tunnels into ovens. This was the hidden edge of the American war machine, not simply the numbers of tanks or planes, but the ability to adapt, to innovate, to turn battlefield necessity into technological advantage. The Japanese believed in spirit and sacrifice, in the will to endure. The Americans brought industry and invention, a synergy of engineers and soldiers. At Iwo Jima, this contrast would play out in the most brutal fashion. The Japanese waited in their tunnels, believing themselves invincible. The Americans brought tanks that turned those tunnels into coffins. Kuribayashi's strategy was brilliant, but it had not accounted for machines that could breathe fire. For the defenders, the realization was crushing. Their doctrines, their expectations, even their faith in survival were undermined by this new weapon. What began as disbelief on that first day grew into dread as more and more bunkers fell to fire. For the Marines, each success reinforced the conviction that, no matter the cost, they would prevail. For the Japanese, each eruption of flame was a reminder that their island fortress was not eternal. The Battle of Iwo Jima was not just a clash of armies. It was a collision of philosophies, spirit against steel, tradition against innovation. And in the middle of it all, the flamethrower tanks became the harbingers of a new reality. No longer was war confined to bullets and shells. Now war was fire. War was annihilation, and the men trapped beneath the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima would be the first to understand what that truly meant. On the second day of the invasion, as the sun clawed its way through a sky heavy with ash and smoke, the Japanese defenders began to notice something strange. The Marines still came, wave after wave, their uniforms blackened by volcanic dust, their faces streaked with sweat and blood. But behind them, rolling steadily over the churned earth, came machines that were different from the Shermans they already feared. At first glance, they were familiar, steel beasts with their squat turrets and rumbling tracks. Yet there was something more. Tanks dragging peculiar trailers behind them, their sides fitted with odd fixtures. Rumors spread quickly through the underground chambers. Some whispered that these machines carried new guns. Others believed they were supply tanks. But when the first bunker mouth erupted in fire, all doubts were incinerated. What the Japanese had seen that morning was not an illusion. The Americans had brought flamethrower tanks, Shermans modified with a weapon unlike anything the defenders had imagined. The hidden advantage was revealed in the roar of compressed fuel bursting into liquid fire. The projectors mounted on these tanks could spit streams of flame that reached across trenches, arched into caves, and penetrated fortifications once thought impenetrable. Where grenades and shells could only chip away, fire flowed into every crevice, consuming oxygen and searing flesh. The shock was immediate and visceral. Soldiers who had drilled for years in the art of endurance, who had been trained to withstand artillery and machine gun fire, now faced an enemy that turned their strongest positions into death traps. For the Marines, the difference was as much psychological as it was tactical. Before the flamethrower tanks arrived, every bunker seemed like an eternal obstacle. Men had to crawl forward under fire, hurling grenades into dark openings, often only to see defenders emerge again, unfazed. Casualties piled up for every yard gained. But when the flamethrower tanks joined the battle, the Marines saw a weapon that finally broke the stalemate. With one squeeze of a lever, entire pillboxes went silent, their defenders either consumed or forced to flee into waiting gunfire. Marines who had been pinned for hours suddenly surged forward, shouting in grim triumph. The tanks didn't just burn bunkers, they lit a fire in the hearts of those who followed them. The Japanese disbelief deepened with every engagement. Their doctrine had been clear: withstand bombardment, bleed the enemy, then counterattack at the moment of weakness. But now there was no weakness to exploit. Every attempt to hold ground was met with fire. The heat rolled through tunnels, the smoke suffocating men long before the flames reached them. Once a soldier could cling to the thought that his bunker would shield him, that his comrades nearby would provide cover. Now he wondered only how long before the fire came. The confidence of years of training, of rehearsed tactics, was eroded in minutes. Reports from surviving Japanese soldiers later revealed the depth of the shock. Some described the tanks as demonic beasts, their flame projectors like the tongues of dragons. Others wrote of the impossibility of fighting back. Bullets rattled harmlessly off the steel armor, grenades bounced from their hulls, and even direct artillery hits sometimes failed to halt their advance. The defenders knew that portable flamethrowers existed. They had faced them before. But this was different. A man with a flamethrower could be shot. A tank could not be so easily silenced. This was no longer a duel between men, but between men and machines that brought fire itself as a weapon. American commanders understood the magnitude of their advantage. They had not invented the flamethrower in 1945. Its roots stretched back through World War I and even ancient warfare. But they had perfected its delivery. By mounting flamethrowers on tanks, they gave the Marines a weapon that combined armor, mobility, and psychological terror. The Japanese were trained to fight tanks with mines, explosives, and anti-tank guns. But how do you fight a weapon that doesn't simply kill you, but erases you? Even the most resolute defenders faltered when confronted by fire that could chase them into the deepest tunnels. The flamethrower tanks revealed another hidden edge of American power: the ability to innovate at scale. In Detroit and across the industrial Midwest, factories had churned out thousands of Sherman tanks. Engineers could modify them for countless roles: mobile artillery, amphibious landers, and now flame projectors. Where the Japanese relied on fixed fortifications, the Americans brought adaptability. Each problem on the battlefield was answered not only with courage but with engineering. The flamethrower tanks were the embodiment of this philosophy: brutal, simple, effective. For the Marines, the presence of these tanks was both salvation and horror. They knew what fire did to men, having seen Japanese soldiers burned alive, their screams mingling with the roar of flame. Some Marines turned away rather than watch. Others confessed years later that the smell, the sickly sweet stench of burning flesh, never left them. Yet in the hellscape of Iwo Jima, where comrades fell in waves and bunkers seemed eternal, the tanks were necessary. Without them, the cost would have been even greater. Fire, terrible as it was, became the only path to survival. For the Japanese, disbelief gave way to grim acceptance. They began to adapt, ordering artillery crews to target the flame tanks first, even at the risk of exposing their positions. Suicide squads attempted to crawl forward with explosives, hoping to detonate beneath the treads. Some succeeded, but many were incinerated before they reached their targets. The balance had shifted irrevocably. Each day, more defenses collapsed under fire. Each night, the survivors retreated deeper into the volcanic labyrinth, knowing that the fire would follow. The hidden advantage was no longer hidden. It was written across the battlefield in blackened bunkers and smoldering caves. The flamethrower tanks had transformed the character of the fight. Where once the Japanese believed their tunnels would grant them immortality, they now saw them as tombs, waiting to be sealed by fire. Where once the Marines braced for endless attrition, they now had a weapon that could shatter the strongest defenses. Iwo Jima was no longer just a clash of armies. It was a crucible of fire, reshaped by machines that turned disbelief into terror and terror into defeat. The flamethrower tank was not born in a single stroke of genius, but in the crucible of necessity. By 1944, American commanders knew that storming Japanese-held islands meant facing fortifications unlike anything in Europe. The Germans built bunkers, yes, but the Japanese carved entire worlds beneath the ground, connected by tunnels, shielded by volcanic stone, immune to bombardment. Portable flamethrowers, while effective, left the men who carried them horribly exposed. To solve this, engineers and soldiers collaborated, fusing two brutal tools of war, the Sherman tank and the flamethrower. The result was a machine designed not just to kill, but to suffocate resistance itself. At the heart of this innovation was the M4 Sherman, the workhorse of the American Armored Corps. The Sherman was not the most powerful tank of the war. It could not match the German Panther or Tiger in sheer firepower or armor. But it was adaptable. With a reliable engine, simple mechanics, and an endless production line, the Sherman became a canvas for countless modifications. Engineers realized that its hull could easily carry the extra weight of a flamethrower system. The challenge was in designing a weapon that could project fire far enough to keep the tank safe, yet compact enough to fit within its frame. The first experiments produced crude results. Tanks dragging fuel trailers like vulnerable appendages, hoses snaking into turrets where a nozzle replaced the machine gun. These designs were dangerous, for a single hit on the fuel could ignite the entire vehicle. But necessity demanded progress. By late 1944, the Navy's Seabees, construction battalions renowned for their ingenuity, worked with Marine Ordnance crews to refine the design. They developed the POACWS-H5, the Pacific Ocean Area Chemical Warfare Service model, mounted on Shermans. This version replaced the standard bow machine gun with a flame projector, capable of firing 150 gallons of fuel in devastating bursts. The specifications were staggering. Where a man-portable flamethrower could spit fire 20 yards, the tank-mounted version reached out to 150 yards. Its pressure system hurled thick streams of napalm gel, clinging to stone, to steel, to flesh. A single burst could last 3 seconds, long enough to engulf a bunker entrance and flood the chamber beyond with heat and smoke. The psychological difference was even greater. A lone Marine with a backpack flamethrower inspired fear, but a tank that could drench entire hillsides in flame was terror incarnate. Inside the tank, the system was brutally simple. Cylinders of compressed nitrogen forced fuel from storage tanks through reinforced hoses. The nozzle, fitted where a machine gun once sat, ignited the stream with a concealed spark. The result was a weapon that turned liquid into fire at the pull of a trigger. Each tank carried enough fuel for multiple bursts, allowing crews to clear bunker after bunker without resupply. To the Marines who followed them, these tanks were angels of survival. To the Japanese who faced them, they were demons in steel. But the brilliance lay not only in range or volume. The Americans had developed napalm, thickened gasoline that clung like molten tar. Unlike pure fuel, napalm did not splash or evaporate quickly. It crawled across surfaces, sticking to uniforms, skin, and concrete. Once ignited, it burned hotter and longer, feeding on itself. In confined spaces, it consumed oxygen, suffocating men before the flames even reached them. For defenders who believed stone walls would protect them, napalm was betrayal made manifest. Their refuge became their coffin. Factories back home fueled this innovation. In Detroit, assembly lines built Shermans by the thousands, each one a blank slate for modification. In smaller plants, engineers fitted flame systems, welding hoses, pumps, and nozzles onto standard hulls. The cost was minimal compared to developing entirely new tanks. American industry could adapt faster than Japan could prepare. Where the Japanese built intricate tunnels with human labor, the Americans built machines that rendered those tunnels obsolete. This contrast defined the Pacific War. One side relying on spirit and fortification, the other on innovation and production. To the crews who operated these tanks, the experience was harrowing. They knew they carried volatile fuel that could ignite if pierced. Japanese defenders quickly recognized the threat and concentrated their fire on the flamethrower tanks. Mortars, artillery, and suicide squads all aimed for them first. The men inside the steel beasts lived with constant fear, yet pressed forward, knowing that their weapon was essential. In letters home, some wrote of the strange mix of pride and horror, pride in saving fellow Marines by clearing bunkers, horror in hearing the screams that followed every burst of fire. The Japanese, for their part, studied these machines with desperate fascination. Intelligence reports described them in precise detail, noting the range of the flame, the tanks on the hull, the vulnerability of the fuel. Countermeasures were devised: camouflaged artillery, ambushes, mines. Yet time and again the flamethrower tanks broke through. Where bullets bounced and grenades failed, fire succeeded. Even when tanks were destroyed, their impact lingered. Survivors spoke of fire rolling down tunnels, of comrades collapsing in smoke-filled chambers, of the unbearable choice between burning alive or charging into machine gun fire. The technical achievement of the flamethrower tank was not in complexity, but in ruthless simplicity. It did not rely on advanced optics or heavy armor. It was a basic Sherman, fitted with a weapon as old as war itself, fire. But fire delivered with industrial precision, on a scale unimaginable to defenders trained in traditional doctrine. For every Japanese bunker, there was now an answer. For every tunnel, a death sentence. The weapon revealed not only American ingenuity, but also the power of industry married to necessity. By the time Iwo Jima was invaded, dozens of flamethrower Shermans had been prepared. They rolled off landing craft like steel dragons, their fuel tanks glistening in the ash. Each one carried the weight of invention, the promise of breaking defenses that no bombardment could touch. In the grand strategy of the Pacific, they were a small piece, but on the battlefield they were decisive. Every bunker silenced by fire meant Marines could advance. Every cave engulfed meant fewer lives lost in frontal assaults. In the cold calculus of war, the technical details translated into survival. And so the flamethrower tank became more than a weapon. It was a symbol of a new kind of warfare, where technology and industry reshaped the very terms of survival. On Iwo Jima, in the tunnels beneath Suribachi and later across Okinawa, its presence defined battles. For the Japanese, it was an enemy beyond comprehension. For the Americans, it was proof that no fortress was eternal. The technical story of pumps and hoses, of nitrogen cylinders and napalm was only half the truth. The other half was written in fire, in bunkers silenced, in defenders broken. It was a weapon born of necessity, perfected by industry, and unleashed in a war where survival demanded nothing less. September 15, 1944, at Peleliu, the Marines had already glimpsed what fire could do. But it was on Iwo Jima, 5 months later, where the flamethrower tanks earned their place in the annals of war. The morning of February 22nd was heavy with smoke and the scent of scorched earth. The black volcanic sand bore the twisted hulks of landing craft and tanks struck down by artillery. Marines clawed forward yard by yard, pinned by snipers hidden in bunkers, harassed by mortars that seemed to fall from invisible hands. It was here, near the base of Mount Suribachi, that the first major test of the flamethrower tanks unfolded. A Sherman groaned forward, its engine coughing under the weight of its fuel load. Marines hugged its sides, using its steel belly as a shield against withering fire. Ahead lay a bunker complex that had resisted 3 days of bombardment. Machine gun fire spat from its apertures like sparks from a furnace. Every approach had been cut down. Mortar teams hidden in nearby caves provided cover fire, turning the ground into a death zone. Then, with a hiss that sliced through the thunder of gunfire, the tank's projector spat its first arc of flame. The fire leapt across the ash like a serpent, crawling into the bunker entrance. For a moment, silence, then the roar of combustion, louder than any shell. A plume of smoke and flame burst from every crack in the structure. Marines watched as the once invincible bunker shuddered, then fell silent. Men who had endured days of naval bombardment were silenced in seconds. The Marines surged forward, rifles at the ready, and found only blackened ruin. A position that might have cost dozens of lives had been erased by a single burst of fire. The effect spread quickly across the battlefield. At another point along the line, 3 Shermans advanced together, each projecting flame in sweeping arcs. They turned caves into furnaces, each burst flushing defenders into the open, where Marines cut them down. Reports from Japanese survivors spoke of the shock, positions believed untouchable, collapsing within minutes. One soldier later wrote that the tanks spit fire like demons from the underworld, their flame licking across rocks, chasing men into corners where no bullet could reach. Numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In the first 4 days on Iwo Jima, the Marines lost nearly 6,800 men. But wherever flamethrower tanks operated, the casualty rate dropped. A bunker that once required squads of men to assault could be silenced by a single tank in under a minute. At one engagement near the quarry north of Suribachi, a single flamethrower Sherman cleared 7 pillboxes in less than half an hour. The Japanese left behind charred weapons, their bodies reduced to ash or twisted black shapes. Marines wrote in their journals of the smell, of the silence that followed, of the eerie efficiency. The Japanese fought back with everything they had. Artillery zeroed in on the tanks, and mines were buried in the sand along likely routes. Suicide squads crept forward at night, carrying satchel charges, hoping to detonate beneath the treads. One tank was lost when a soldier threw himself beneath it, detonating a charge that set off the fuel. The resulting fireball lit the sky, a grim mirror of the destruction the tank itself had unleashed. Yet for every tank destroyed, several more pressed forward, each one taking the fight deeper into the island's defenses. The battle near Hill 382, later known as the Meat Grinder, was perhaps the clearest example of their impact. The hill bristled with bunkers and interlocking fields of fire. Marines who attempted to advance were shredded within minutes. Then came the flamethrower tanks. Moving cautiously, covered by infantry, they approached the base of the hill. One by one they drenched the bunkers with fire. The hill erupted in plumes of smoke and flame. For hours, the tanks moved methodically, silencing positions that had stalled progress for days. By evening, the Marines had taken ground once thought unassailable. German reports from Europe often spoke of American tanks as inferior, dismissing the Sherman as a weak opponent for the Panther or Tiger. But in the Pacific, against an enemy relying on fortifications rather than armored divisions, the Sherman became something else entirely. Its gun was less important than its projector. Its armor, though vulnerable to heavy guns, was sufficient against infantry weapons, and its ability to bring flame transformed it from a support vehicle into the spearhead of the assault. Even Japanese commanders acknowledged the shock. In a captured report from a surviving officer, he described the tanks as the most fearsome enemy of the island. He noted that men refused to stay in bunkers once they heard the hiss of approaching flame. Courage, discipline, even fanaticism crumbled in the face of suffocation and fire. Soldiers who had sworn never to surrender sometimes fled in terror, abandoning positions that had taken months to prepare. In a war where morale was often as decisive as firepower, the flamethrower tank was both a weapon and a psychological earthquake. Marines, too, felt the emotional weight. Some wrote that they hated the tanks, not for their effect but for what they forced them to witness. Screams from inside bunkers carried across the battlefield. The smell of burning flesh clung to uniforms, followed them back to foxholes, haunted their dreams. Yet they also admitted relief. Without the tanks, they believed, the casualties would have doubled. In their grim calculus, horror was a price worth paying for survival. By the end of the Iwo Jima campaign, flamethrower tanks had been credited with clearing hundreds of positions. Their kill ratios could not be measured in tank duels or artillery barrages, but in bunkers silenced, tunnels collapsed, and Marines saved from certain death. At the cost of a few tanks and their crews, thousands of defenders were eliminated. The balance was staggering, a testament to the brutal efficiency of fire. The first major battle examples proved beyond doubt that the flamethrower tank was not merely an experiment, but a weapon of decision. At Iwo Jima, its presence turned stalemate into advance, disbelief into defeat. Where the Marines had once feared endless attrition, they now saw a path forward. And where the Japanese had once believed their island fortress invincible, they now faced the undeniable truth. No wall, no bunker, no tunnel could stand against fire delivered by steel. The battle for Iwo Jima was more than a clash of weapons. It was a collision of wills, and into that crucible the flamethrower tanks poured not just fire, but a psychological shockwave that rippled through both sides. Strategically, their effect was undeniable. Where once the Japanese doctrine had relied on fortifications and attrition, the flamethrower tanks stripped them of their greatest advantage. No matter how deep the tunnel, no matter how thick the bunker, the tanks could reach inside and turn safety into suffocation. This was not just destruction, it was disorientation, the unraveling of a defense plan built on the belief that the ground itself could be trusted. Kuribayashi's strategy had been masterful on paper. He had transformed Iwo Jima into a fortress, a killing ground where every yard would cost blood. He had ordered his men to fight from concealed positions, to conserve ammunition until the Americans were within range, to drag out the battle and sap the invaders' strength. Yet the flamethrower tanks neutralized this doctrine with terrifying speed. A bunker designed to withstand weeks of bombardment could be silenced in moments. The carefully crafted network of tunnels became a liability, channeling flame and smoke into every corner. The very geography that Kuribayashi relied on became the Americans' ally once the tanks arrived. The strategic ripple was immense. Every position eliminated by flame saved the Marines from days of costly assaults. Progress, though still grueling, accelerated in areas where tanks operated. Commanders recognized that the tanks were not merely support. They were essential instruments of breakthrough. Reports flowed back to higher command, praising the efficiency of the Ronsons. The message was clear. In the brutal grind of island warfare, firepower alone was not enough. Fire itself was needed, but beyond strategy, the psychological impact was even more profound. For the Japanese, fire stripped away the last vestiges of control. A soldier could harden his heart against bullets, believing that his courage might outlast the storm. He could steel himself against artillery, trusting in the strength of stone. But against flame there was no defense, no endurance. The knowledge that death could come not as a clean bullet or a sudden blast, but as suffocating fire, gnawed at morale. Defenders spoke of hearing the hiss of approaching tanks and feeling panic rise in their chests. Even the most fanatical warriors, drilled to prefer death over surrender, faltered when faced with a fire that erased the very air they breathed. In contrast, the Marines felt a surge of grim confidence. Each time a bunker collapsed in fire, they saw a path forward where before there had been only slaughter. The tanks became a symbol of inevitability, proof that no defense could last forever. This psychological edge fueled momentum. Marines who had lost comrades by the dozen felt a renewed determination when they saw the flame projectors spewing fire into once untouchable strongholds. They no longer fought blind against hidden enemies. They watched as those enemies were flushed out, their shadows chased into daylight. Yet this confidence came at a cost. The Marines could not unsee what the tanks did. The screams from within the bunkers, the sight of men engulfed, the stench that clung to the battlefield, all of it left scars. Some later admitted that the weapon, though necessary, felt like a glimpse of hell itself. Commanders spoke of psychological effectiveness, but for those who watched it was horror dressed as salvation. The paradox became part of the Marine identity. They both relied on and recoiled from the weapon that saved them. For the Japanese, the impact extended beyond Iwo Jima. Survivors who escaped to later battles carried with them the memory of the fire tanks. At Okinawa, reports circulated before the invasion even began. The Americans had tanks that breathed fire. These whispers spread through the garrisons, planting seeds of dread before the first shot was fired. Soldiers dug their bunkers deeper, tried to prepare countermeasures, but the shadow of fire hung over them. Strategy bent beneath the weight of anticipation. The flamethrower tank was no longer just a weapon. It was a reputation, a psychological presence that fought alongside the Marines. Even American generals recognized the dual nature of this advantage. They saw how the tanks accelerated victories, how they broke the stalemate of tunnel warfare. But they also noted the toll on their own men. Reports spoke of Marines shaken not only by combat, but by the nature of the weapon itself. Some compared it to gas warfare, a weapon that killed not only with heat but with terror. Yet the demands of the Pacific War left no room for hesitation. To break the Japanese defenses, every tool was needed. Fire was the price of progress. The broader strategic lesson was unmistakable. The flamethrower tanks revealed that in modern war, victory did not always come from superior armor or heavier guns. It came from disrupting the enemy's doctrine, breaking not just his body, but his belief in his own survival. The Japanese built their entire defense on the conviction that their tunnels could outlast American firepower. When that conviction burned away, so too did their ability to fight as planned. In that moment, strategy collapsed into chaos, and chaos belonged to the side with fire. For the Americans, the impact shaped their approach to the final stages of the Pacific campaign. At Okinawa, flamethrower tanks were deployed in greater numbers, their presence written into the battle plan. Commanders requested them by priority, understanding that no infantry assault should proceed without them. Industry back home responded, modifying more Shermans, refining the systems, ensuring that when the next fortress island was faced, fire would be ready. Psychologically, the war itself shifted. The Japanese had once believed that their willingness to die made them invincible. But the flamethrower tank proved that no spirit, no doctrine, no bunker could withstand annihilation by fire. The Americans, in turn, embraced the lesson that innovation and adaptability outweighed even the strongest defenses. In the Pacific, where every mile was bought with blood, the tanks shortened the distance to victory, not by lessening sacrifice, but by making progress possible where none seemed imaginable. In the end, the strategic and psychological impact of the flamethrower tanks was inseparable. They burned through fortresses and through mines alike. They silenced guns and shattered beliefs. They offered the Marines a grim kind of hope and left the Japanese in the grip of despair. On Iwo Jima, the war had become a contest not only of steel and courage, but of perception, of endurance, of the will to keep fighting. Fire tipped the balance, proving that in modern warfare sometimes the deadliest weapon was not the largest gun or the thickest armor, but the terror of knowing there was nowhere left to hide. When the guns finally fell silent on Iwo Jima, the island was a graveyard of blackened stone and steel. Nearly 21,000 Japanese defenders had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 survivors. Almost 7,000 Marines lay dead, and over 19,000 more were wounded. The ground itself still smoked in places, scarred by fire that had burned not just through men, but through the very memory of the place. And among the machines left rusting on the beaches, the flamethrower tanks stood out, hulking dragons of steel, their nozzles charred, their fuel tanks empty, their work finished. They had become more than weapons. They were symbols of the war's relentless evolution. The legacy of those tanks reached far beyond Iwo Jima. Strategically, they demonstrated the triumph of adaptation. The Japanese had built fortresses they believed invincible, carved from stone, linked by tunnels, hidden from bombardment. Yet American industry and ingenuity had produced a weapon that negated those defenses. The lesson was clear. In modern war, no defense was absolute. Every wall could be breached, every doctrine undone. What mattered was not the strength of a position, but the ability to adapt faster than the enemy. In Okinawa, this lesson was applied with brutal efficiency. Flamethrower tanks rolled alongside infantry in greater numbers, their presence expected, their effect amplified. Positions that might have held for days fell in hours. Survivors from Iwo Jima whispered warnings, but whispers could not stop fire. The tanks shortened battles not by ending sacrifice, but by ensuring that progress was made where once there had been stalemate. And in the eyes of American commanders, this meant lives saved, objectives achieved, and the war brought one step closer to its final conclusion. Yet the psychological legacy was perhaps greater than the tactical one. Japanese soldiers who survived Iwo Jima carried home stories of fire that no courage could withstand. Civilians on the home islands heard rumors of tanks that spat flame, of bunkers turned into ovens. Fear spread, and with it the realization that even the homeland's caves and tunnels might not protect them. For a nation preparing for a last stand, the knowledge that fire could penetrate the earth itself was devastating. The flamethrower tank became part of the shadow that hung over Japan in 1945, a harbinger of annihilation. For the Americans, the memory was double-edged. Marines who followed behind the tanks never forgot what they saw, what they smelled, what they heard. Some spoke of gratitude, convinced the tanks had saved them from certain death. Others confessed to nightmares, haunted by screams carried on the wind. The flamethrower tanks revealed not only the ingenuity of war, but its horror. They forced men to confront the truth that survival sometimes demanded methods that blurred the line between weapon and atrocity. The legacy was not just victory, it was a scar etched into memory. After the war, the lessons of the flamethrower tanks echoed into the Cold War. Military strategists studied Iwo Jima and Okinawa, noting that fire had broken fortifications where bombs and bullets had failed. The concept evolved. Networked firepower, combined arms, and the idea of overwhelming adaptation became doctrines. Tanks carrying flamethrowers continued to serve in Korea and even in Vietnam, where their grim effectiveness was once again on display. Each time they reminded soldiers and commanders alike that in the unforgiving calculus of battle, terror itself was a weapon. But as technology advanced, so too did the philosophy of war. By the Gulf War, the flamethrower tank had faded into obsolescence, replaced by precision weapons, guided missiles, and systems designed to eliminate the need for such brutal methods. Yet the core lesson endured. Connection, adaptability, and innovation outweighed brute strength. Where the Germans had built Tigers and the Japanese had built tunnels, the Americans had built Shermans that breathed fire, and they had prevailed not because their machines were perfect, but because they were effective together. One Japanese officer, reflecting after the war, admitted with haunting clarity, "We built defenses we thought eternal, but you built weapons to defeat them." Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, from another theater of war, had once said of the Allies, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." The flamethrower Sherman embodied that truth. It was not the most powerful machine, nor the most elegant. It was crude, dangerous, and horrifying, but it worked, in coordination, in context, in the brutal reality of the Pacific. And so the legacy of Iwo Jima is more than the image of the flag raised on Mount Suribachi. It is the memory of fire rolling through tunnels, of steel dragons exhaling flame, of defenders realizing that their fortress had become their tomb. It is the reminder that in war, survival often depends not on strength alone, but on the ability to change, to innovate, to wield even the most terrible tools when the moment demands it. The island remains sacred ground today, a place of pilgrimage for Marines, and a silent monument for Japanese who still honor their dead. Beneath the memorials and the volcanic ash lies the memory of a weapon that defined the battle, not by the number of tanks destroyed or miles gained, but by the fear it instilled, the doctrine it shattered, and the victory it made possible. In the end, the lesson of Iwo Jima is universal. Firepower can break walls, courage can win moments, but connection between men, between machines, between innovation and necessity, wins wars. The flamethrower tanks of Iwo Jima proved that survival was not about having the strongest fortress, but about ensuring that no fortress could withstand what you brought against it. They burned not only through stone and steel, but through the illusions of invincibility. And in their wake they left a truth that endures. In modern war, speed defeats armor, and fire consumes even the most unbreakable walls.